Some betrayals cut so deep, they change the very shape of your soul, and at 63, I learned that the cruelest wounds often come from those who should protect what you hold most sacred. Catherine is my name, and for 40 years as an investment banker, I dedicated my life to protecting people's financial futures with the same fierce devotion I brought to raising my son Michael. I thought I understood the weight of responsibility, the sacred trust of safeguarding someone's legacy. When Michael blessed me with grandchildren, little Lily, now 5, and Tom, just 3, I poured every ounce of love into planning for their security, believing our family bond was unbreakable. Then Michael suddenly passed, leaving behind a carefully planned $1.3 million inheritance for his devastated wife, Anna, and their precious children. Before the funeral flowers had even wilted, Richard, Anna's absent father, who'd been nowhere to be found during Michael's life, emerged from the shadows like a vulture. Burdened by $700,000 in hidden debts, he swooped in with legal papers and cruel dismissals. Anna is too emotionally frail to handle this money, he declared in court, his voice dripping with false concern. Catherine is just a retired old lady with no business sense. Stay out of this hag. His sneer cut through me like a blade as he systematically dismantled everything Michael had built, everything I'd taught him about protecting those we love. But Richard had no idea what he'd awakened, what he, Anna, and their lawyer, Mr. Davies, didn't know was my secret arsenal. 4 decades of financial expertise, meticulous digital backups of Michael's carefully planned estate, and most damning of all, hidden audits revealing Richard's extensive, undisclosed $700,000 debt and his pattern of reckless financial behavior. My former federal judge ally was waiting in the wings. This time, their monstrous greed wouldn't just unravel. It would expose their predatory cruelty and prove that a grandmother's love, armed with professional expertise, could triumph over the darkest financial manipulation. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at Mr. Davies's downtown law office, just 5 days after we'd laid my beloved Michael to rest. I arrived early, hoping to have a few quiet moments with Anna to comfort her and discuss Michael's carefully laid plans for the children's future. Instead, I found Richard already ensconced behind the attorney's massive desk as if he owned the place. Catherine, he said, without looking up from the papers spread before him, his tone as cold as winter steel. Punctual as always, though I'm not sure why you felt the need to attend this family meeting. Family meeting. As if I weren't Michael's mother, as if I hadn't been the one to rock him to sleep as a baby, to teach him his first lessons about money and responsibility, to stand by his side through every triumph and heartbreak of his 35 years. Anna sat hunched in a corner chair, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. She barely acknowledged my presence, this woman I'd welcomed into our family with open arms, whom I'd supported through difficult pregnancies and sleepless nights with newborns. Anna, sweetheart, I said, gently settling into the chair beside her. How are you holding up? I know this is overwhelming, but Michael left very clear instructions about the children's trust funds and education accounts. Before Anna could respond, Richard's voice cut across the room like a whip crack. That's exactly what we need to discuss, Catherine. Your son may have had good intentions, but his financial planning was, shall we say, optimistic for someone so young. Anna needs real guidance now, professional management of this inheritance. I felt my professional instincts sharpen. Richard Michael's estate planning was exemplary. We worked together for years to structure these accounts. Every dollar was allocated with purpose: education trusts, emergency funds, long-term investments that will grow with the children. Richard finally looked up, his expression a mixture of condescension and barely concealed hostility. "Catherine, with all due respect, you're retired. The financial world has changed dramatically since your time. Anna needs someone with current expertise, someone who understands modern investment strategies." The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so insulting. This man who'd been absent from Anna's life for most of her childhood was lecturing me about financial expertise while hiding nearly $750,000 in personal debt. That's when Mr. Davies arrived, a thin man in an expensive suit who immediately began organizing papers with theatrical efficiency. "Mrs. Catherine Morrison," he said formally, "I'm James Davies, representing Mr. Richard Coleman in this guardianship matter. I understand you have some concerns about the estate management. I have concerns about why guardianship is even being discussed," I replied firmly. "Anna is a competent adult and loving mother. Michael's will clearly designates her as the beneficiary and guardian of the children's inheritance." Mr. Davies exchanged a meaningful look with Richard before responding. "Mrs. Morrison, while Mrs. Anna Coleman is indeed the named beneficiary, Mr. Richard Coleman has filed a petition for financial guardianship based on her current emotional state and his superior business experience." That's when Richard stood up, and I saw the predator behind the concerned father facade. "Let me be crystal clear, Catherine," he said, his voice rising with each word. "Anna is a good mother, but she's emotionally frail. She can't possibly manage a $1.3 million inheritance in her current state. My extensive business experience makes me the only suitable guardian for this money." I watched Anna shrink further into her chair, and my heart broke for her. Here was a woman drowning in grief being told by her own father that she was incompetent to manage her deceased husband's legacy. "What business experience?" I asked pointedly. "Richard, I've been an investment banker for 4 decades. I've managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Michael and I spent years creating a conservative, growth-oriented plan for these funds." Richard's face flushed with anger. "Your Honor," he said, though no judge was present practicing his speech for the upcoming court hearing, "Catherine is just an old lady who's losing her grip on reality. She has no understanding of modern finance, no comprehension of what it takes to truly protect these children's future. She has no humanity to understand the complexities of what we're dealing with here." The words hit me like physical blows. Just an old lady, losing her grip on reality, no humanity. This from a man who'd abandoned his daughter for years and was now circling her inheritance like a shark. "Stay out of this, hag." Richard suddenly exploded, his careful facade cracking completely. "This is my family's money now, and I won't have some senile old woman interfering with what needs to be done." The silence that followed was deafening. Anna's soft crying was the only sound in the room, and I realized with dawning horror that she wasn't going to defend me. The woman I treated like a daughter, whom I'd supported through Michael's illness and death, was going to sit silently while her father verbally abused me. Mr. Davies cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should schedule a formal meeting with all parties present and proper documentation." Over the following days, the humiliation campaign began in earnest. Mr. Davies started subtly leaking details to local news outlets about the family dispute over Michael's estate. The stories painted me as a controlling mother-in-law unable to accept her son's death, clinging desperately to relevance through his money. "Grief-stricken mother battles daughter-in-law over son's estate," read one particularly cruel headline. The article quoted sources close to the family, describing my irrational behavior and inability to accept modern financial realities. But the worst humiliation came when Richard filed additional motions with the court. He demanded a psychological evaluation of me, claiming my age, and grief had caused significant cognitive decline. He requested that I be barred from accessing any of Michael's financial records, alleging that my interference was causing Anna additional emotional distress. The court documents were filled with carefully crafted lies. Richard described me as obsessively controlling and unable to accept appropriate boundaries. He painted Anna as a fragile widow being harassed by an overbearing mother-in-law who couldn't let go. My other children, Mark and Lisa, were furious but felt powerless to help. They'd offered to testify on my behalf, but Richard's legal team had somehow managed to frame the entire situation as a private family matter that should be resolved without outside interference. The most devastating blow came when I tried to visit Lily and Tom. Anna, clearly coached by her father, met me at the door with tears in her eyes. "Catherine, I'm sorry, but Dad thinks it's best if you don't see the children right now. He says the legal stress is confusing them and they need stability." I looked past her into the living room, where I could see my grandchildren playing the same children I'd babysat countless weekends, whose bedtime stories I knew by heart, whose favorite cookies I baked every Tuesday. "Anna," I said, my voice breaking, "they're my grandchildren. Michael would never have wanted them kept from me." "I know," she whispered, "but Dad says the courts might see it as manipulation if I let you influence them during the guardianship proceedings." As she closed the door, I heard little Tom calling out, "Is that Grandma Catherine? I want to show her my new truck." But the door was already shut, and I was standing alone on the porch of what had once felt like a second home, now barred from the children I loved more than my own life. That night, sitting in my empty house, surrounded by photos of Michael and the grandchildren, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my early days on Wall Street, the cold, calculating fury of someone who'd been underestimated by a predator. Richard thought he could intimidate me with legal maneuvers and public humiliation. He thought my age and grief made me vulnerable to his manipulation. He had no idea that he'd just declared war on a woman who'd spent 40 years destroying financial predators for a living. The weeks following the initial court filing brought a systematic escalation of Richard's control over Anna and the children that was both masterful and terrifying to witness. Each move was calculated to isolate me further while tightening his grip on Michael's inheritance. The first sign of his true intentions came through another legal filing from Mr. Davies. Richard was claiming that a substantial portion of the inheritance, nearly $500,000, needed to be immediately transferred to his high-end investment firm for urgent, time-sensitive opportunities that couldn't be delayed. I read the documents with growing alarm. The language was deliberately vague, filled with financial jargon designed to sound impressive while revealing nothing concrete about these supposed investment opportunities. My 40 years of experience recognized it immediately as the kind of double talk used by scam artists to separate desperate people from their money. When I tried to discuss my concerns with Anna, I found my access to her even more restricted. Richard had moved into Michael's house ostensibly to help with the children during this difficult transition, but effectively becoming a gatekeeper who controlled every interaction. "Anna needs space to heal," he told me during a brief phone conversation that felt more like a hostage negotiation. "Your constant questions about the money are adding to her stress. The courts have made it clear that interference with the guardianship process could be seen as harassment. But it was Anna's own words that revealed how completely she'd been manipulated. "Catherine," she said, during what would be our last direct conversation for months, Dad explained that you're just not equipped to understand modern investment strategies. He says the old-fashioned approaches you and Michael used are too conservative for today's market. We could lose everything if we don't move quickly. The irony was staggering. Richard was convincing Anna that the careful conservative portfolio Michael and I had built over years of planning was somehow dangerous, while his own reckless schemes were the safe choice. That's when I received the cryptic message that changed everything. Margaret Chen, a former colleague from my banking days, sent me a brief email that seemed innocuous on the surface. "Catherine, I heard about your family situation. You might be interested in some discussions happening on the Financial Professionals Forum. Search for Coleman Investment Strategies in the Fraud Prevention section." What I found there made my blood run cold. Multiple posts from financial professionals across 3 states, all warning about a man named Richard Coleman, who operated under various business names, targeting grieving widows and elderly investors with promises of extraordinary returns. The pattern was always the same. He'd present himself as an experienced financial advisor, gain access to substantial sums through emotional manipulation, then disappear when the investments inevitably failed. One post was particularly chilling. Coleman convinced my client to liquidate her deceased husband's entire retirement account for a once-in-a-lifetime cryptocurrency opportunity. 6 months later, the money was gone and Coleman had vanished. We're still trying to track down where the funds actually went. Another read: "This man is a predator who specifically targets families dealing with recent deaths. He exploits their grief and confusion to gain control of life insurance payouts and estate funds. Multiple victims, always the same pattern." The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Richard wasn't just seeking guardianship to help Anna manage the inheritance. He was planning to systematically embezzle his own grandchildren's future, using their mother's grief and his fabricated authority to steal everything Michael had worked to provide for them. But as devastating as this revelation was, it also awakened a memory I'd buried so deeply I'd almost forgotten it existed: the secret sacrifice that had defined Michael's early career and shaped everything that came after. It was 12 years earlier when Michael, then a promising young financial analyst, had gotten involved in what seemed like a legitimate investment opportunity. A senior colleague had brought him into a high-risk venture that promised extraordinary returns, and Michael, eager to prove himself and provide for his growing family, had invested not just his own money, but borrowed heavily to maximize his position. When the investment collapsed spectacularly, Michael found himself facing $200,000 in debt that threatened to destroy his career before it had truly begun. The scandal would have ruined his reputation and brought shame to our family name in the tight-knit financial community. I'd used my entire personal savings, over $100,000, plus additional loans that took me years to repay, to quietly settle Michael's debts. But more than the money, I'd used my professional connections and reputation to create a paper trail that protected him from the fallout. I'd meticulously fabricated records showing that Michael had been a minor investor who'd pulled out before the collapse rather than one of the primary victims. Michael never knew the full extent of what I'd done to save him. I'd told him I'd helped arrange a settlement, but kept the devastating financial cost to myself. I'd sacrificed my own retirement security to ensure that his future remained intact. Now, as I stared at the warnings about Richard's fraudulent schemes, I felt the bitter irony crushing my chest. The son I'd saved from financial ruin was now being used as bait to justify another predator's attack on his own children's inheritance. When I tried to share my concerns about Richard's background with Anna, the response was swift and brutal. "You're always trying to make Dad look bad," Richard shouted during a confrontation at the courthouse. "You can't stand that Anna has family who actually cares about her welfare. You're just a bitter old woman trying to control everyone around you." Anna, standing beside him with tears streaming down her face, looked at me with something approaching hatred. "Catherine, please stop. You're destroying Dad's reputation with these wild accusations. You're making everything worse for the children." The final insult came in the form of Mr. Davies's generous settlement offer. If I would completely relinquish all guardianship claims and publicly acknowledge Richard's superior qualifications to manage the estate, I would receive a token $50,000 consulting fee and a statement recognizing my past contributions to Michael's financial planning. In exchange, Richard would graciously agree not to file criminal charges against me for obstructing the will and harassment of a grieving family. It was designed to be the ultimate humiliation, being paid off like a troublesome employee and forced to publicly validate the man who was stealing my grandchildren's future. But as I read those settlement papers, sitting in my empty house, surrounded by 40 years of professional achievements and financial expertise, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: absolute clarity. Richard had made the mistake that all financial predators eventually make. He'd become so confident in his manipulation that he'd forgotten to consider what he was really dealing with. He thought he was facing a grieving grandmother, isolated and overwhelmed by legal complexity. He had no idea he was about to go to war with someone who'd built her career on exposing and destroying people exactly like him. The legal papers that arrived by certified mail on a gray Monday morning felt like a death sentence written in formal legal language. I signed for them with hands that trembled, not from age, but from the rage building inside me as I read Richard's final devastating assault on my family. A temporary restraining order based on fabricated claims of harassment and emotional distress. Richard, through Mr. Davies, had convinced a judge that my obsessive interference in the guardianship proceedings posed a threat to Anna's emotional stability and the children's welfare. The order was comprehensive and cruel. I was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Anna Lily Tom or any of Richard's associates. Any attempt to contact them directly or indirectly would result in immediate arrest. I was legally barred from the grandchildren I'd helped raise, the daughter-in-law I'd supported through pregnancy, and lost the family that had been my whole world since Michael's death. But the cruelest blow was a second document notification that Richard had gained temporary control of Michael's entire estate, including the life insurance policies and savings accounts for emergency estate management. With the stroke of a pen, he'd cut me off from any ability to monitor or protect the children's inheritance. The man who'd been absent from Anna's life for decades now had complete legal authority over the money my son had spent years carefully planning and protecting. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the silence that had once been filled with my grandchildren's laughter, and felt the full weight of my isolation. Richard had systematically removed every connection I had to Michael's family, every avenue I might use to protect what my son had built for his children. But grief makes people desperate, and desperate people sometimes do desperate things. I spent the next 3 days creating something precious, a photo album filled with memories of Michael as a father of Lily and Tom's happiest moments of our family before Richard's poison had infected everything. Pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, of bedtime stories and playground adventures, of all the love that had been real before it was twisted into something ugly by greed. I wrote a letter to accompany the album, pouring my heart onto the page in words I hoped would reach some part of Anna that still remembered who she'd been before her father's manipulation. Dearest Anna, I know you're in pain, and I know your father has convinced you that I'm the source of your problems. But I need you to remember who Michael was, what he wanted for his children, and what our family meant to each other before grief and greed tore us apart. These photos are proof of the love we shared. Please don't let that love be destroyed by people who never cared enough to be part of it when it mattered. I left the album on Anna's doorstep late one evening, knowing I was violating the restraining order, but hoping that love might still matter more than legal technicalities. For 3 days, I heard nothing. Then I saw the social media post that shattered what remained of my heart. Richard's business associate had posted a photo on Instagram showing my carefully created album, torn apart pages scattered across what looked like a garbage can. The caption was a masterpiece of casual cruelty, cleaning out the clutter. Some people just can't let go of the past, moving forward to real money. Future is now smart investing. The comments below were even worse. People I didn't recognize celebrating the destruction of my memories, calling me a crazy old lady who needed to learn her place. The intimate family photos I'd treasured were being mocked by strangers who saw them as nothing more than fodder for online entertainment. But the most devastating realization was that Anna had allowed this to happen. She'd either actively participated in destroying those memories or passively stood by while someone else did it for her. Either way, the message was clear. I meant nothing to her now. Our shared history was worthless, and even my love for her children had been redefined as something toxic and unwelcome. That evening, Richard sent me a text message that felt like a final nail in the coffin of our family. Consider this closed tag. You lose. Don't contact us again. Ever. This is my family's money now, and there's nothing you can do to stop me from doing what's best for it. He followed up with a public Facebook post accompanied by professional photos of himself with Lily and Tom at some upscale restaurant. So grateful for the opportunity to guide my grandchildren toward a secure financial future. Sometimes protecting the ones we love means making difficult decisions about who deserves access to them. Family first. Financial security. The cruelest part was seeing my grandchildren in those photos dressed up like little accessories to Richard's image campaign. Lily and Tom, who'd once run to me with arms outstretched, now looked uncomfortable and confused in the pictures, as if they weren't quite sure why Grandma Catherine had suddenly disappeared from their lives. The final encounter came by accident at the courthouse during another hearing I wasn't allowed to attend, but couldn't stop myself from watching from across the street. I saw them walking up the steps, Richard in his expensive suit with Anna, and the children trailing behind him like props in his performance. When Lily saw me through the crowd, her face lit up for just a moment before Richard leaned down and whispered something in her ear. I watched my granddaughter's expression change, saw her physically recoil, and move closer to Richard as if I were something dangerous. Grandma's mean. I heard Tom whisper to his sister the words carrying across the courthouse plaza like a dagger to my heart. Mean. That's what they'd taught my grandchildren to believe about me. The woman who'd sung them lullabies and bandaged their scraped knees was now someone to be feared and avoided. That night, sitting alone in my house with nowhere left to turn, I called Judge Patricia Williams, a former colleague who'd retired from the federal bench but still maintained her connections in the legal community. Patricia, I said, my voice breaking, I need to tell you something I've never told anyone. about Michael, about the sacrifices I made to protect him, and about what's happening to his children now. What came out was the deepest, most guarded secret of my life as a mother. When Michael was 22, just starting his career in finance, we'd received devastating news from his doctor. Genetic testing had revealed that he'd inherited a rare form of muscular dystrophy from his biological father, my late husband. The prognosis was grim: progressive muscle weakness, eventual wheelchair dependence, and a dramatically shortened lifespan. The doctor's words still echoed in my memory. He might have 10 good years, maybe 15 if we're lucky. The progression varies, but it's always ultimately fatal. I'd made a decision that night that would define the rest of my life. Michael would never know about his diagnosis. I would spare him the burden of knowing he was dying, the despair of counting down his remaining years, the guilt of bringing children into the world, knowing he might not live to see them grow up. For 13 years, I'd maintained that lie. I'd secretly funded experimental treatments, paying over $500,000 from my personal investments for therapies that slowed the disease's progression. I'd fabricated stories about minor health issues to explain his occasional weakness, carefully orchestrated his medical care to ensure the truth never emerged. When Michael married Anna, when they had children, when he built his career and planned for their future, he did it all believing he had a normal life expectancy. He died thinking he'd been taken too soon by a sudden illness, never knowing that every year I'd helped him live had been borrowed time paid for with my own financial future. Now, I told Patricia through my tears, Richard is stealing the inheritance Michael left for children he never knew might grow up without their father. He's exploiting their mother's grief and turning them against the grandmother who sacrificed everything to give their father the life he had. The cosmic irony was unbearable. I'd spent my life savings extending Michael's time on Earth, ensuring he could provide for his family before the disease claimed him. Now a predator was stealing the legacy of that sacrifice, using my own grandchildren as weapons against me. Patricia listened in silence until I finished, then spoke with the quiet authority that had made her one of the most respected judges in the state. Catherine, she said, what you're describing isn't just family conflict. It's systematic elder abuse and financial fraud on a massive scale. And if Richard thinks he can hide behind legal technicalities while stealing from orphaned children, he's about to discover what federal investigators think about predators who exploit grieving families. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. Not hope exactly, but something harder and more determined. Richard had made the fatal mistake of assuming I was just another grieving grandmother who could be bullied into submission. He'd forgotten that I was also a woman who'd spent 40 years protecting people's financial futures from exactly the kind of predator he was. The loving grandmother who'd spent 13 years protecting her son from devastating truth was gone, destroyed by Richard's cruelty. What remained was someone who finally understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop lying even when the truth will destroy everything the people you love believe about their lives, even when exposing one secret means revealing them all. The days following my complete expulsion from my grandchildren's lives felt like descending into a psychological prison where the walls were built from my own carefully guarded secrets. I found myself trapped in a terrifying abyss of isolation, carrying the weight of Michael's hidden illness and 13 years of protective lies that now felt like stones around my neck, pulling me deeper into despair. The restraining order had accomplished exactly what Richard intended. I was utterly alone with the most agonizing secret of my life. Every morning, I'd wake up reaching for my phone to call and check on Lily and Tom, only to remember that such contact was now illegal. Every evening, I'd sit in my empty house, surrounded by silence that once had been filled with their laughter and bedtime stories. The weight of Michael's secret illness pressed against my chest like a physical burden. For 13 years, I'd carried the knowledge that my son was dying while he lived his life, believing he had decades ahead of him. I'd funded experimental treatments that cost me my retirement savings, orchestrated medical appointments that kept him ignorant of his prognosis, and maintained the exhausting performance of a concerned but not terrified mother. Now accused of being mentally unstable myself, I began to question everything. Had I been wrong to protect Michael from the truth? Had my years of loving deception somehow twisted into the very manipulation Richard now accused me of? The revelation that my entire family's stability had been built on a protective lie I'd perpetuated was becoming the foundation of my undoing, turning my past into a source of constant torment. But the psychological isolation was nothing compared to what Richard and Mr. Davies did next. The whisper campaign began subtly, as these things always do in professional circles. Phone calls were made to the investment banking associations where I'd maintained my membership for decades. Concerned inquiries about my recent behavior reached the private wealth management firms where I'd built my reputation. "We're worried about Catherine Morrison." The calls would begin, always couched in false compassion. "There have been some troubling incidents involving inappropriate financial advice and what appears to be cognitive decline. We thought you should know given her history of working with high net worth clients." Within weeks, I received a series of devastating phone calls. The Investment Banking Institute politely informed me they were restructuring their membership and my annual renewal would not be accepted. The Financial Planning Board suddenly found my certifications needed additional review due to questions about professional conduct. Consulting opportunities I'd relied on for supplemental income quietly disappeared, always with apologies and vague mentions of changed risk tolerance. My entire professional reputation, built over 40 years of impeccable service, was being systematically dismantled by whispers and insinuations. Former colleagues stopped returning my calls. Professional networks that had been my second family began treating me like a liability. The financial pressure mounted with each passing day. Legal fees for defending against Richard's guardianship petition were draining my savings faster than I could track. But the devastating blow came when my bank accounts were frozen, pending Richard's new lawsuit, claiming I was mentally incompetent to manage my own finances. The irony was staggering. A woman who'd managed hundreds of millions of dollars in client portfolios was being declared unfit to handle her own modest retirement savings by a man who owed $700,000 in hidden debts. Within a month, I received the eviction notice I'd been dreading. Without access to my frozen accounts, I couldn't pay my mortgage or even basic living expenses. The house where I'd raised Michael, where I'd planned to spend my golden years surrounded by grandchildren's visits, was being foreclosed. The public auction of my possessions was deliberately scheduled and publicized. Richard made sure the local media covered the estate sale of the troubled former banker, ensuring maximum humiliation. I watched strangers rifle through 40 years of memories, purchasing my furniture and personal belongings to pay legal fees I'd never should have incurred. The shelter I was forced to enter was a concrete block building filled with the sounds of other broken lives, other people who'd fallen through society's cracks. My roommates were women decades younger than me, victims of domestic violence and addiction, who looked at me with confusion, unable to understand how someone with my background had ended up among them. But the cruelest blow was yet to come, and it arrived through social media of all places. Richard had organized a charity event for something called the Children's Legacy Fund, positioning himself as a champion of orphan children's financial security. The local news covered it extensively, featuring photos of Richard at a podium looking distinguished and compassionate as he spoke about protecting vulnerable inheritances. In the center of the coverage was a video that stopped my heart. Lily, my 5-year-old granddaughter, standing at a microphone that had been lowered to her height, reciting words that were clearly not her own. "Grandpa Richard is saving our money," she said, her little voice serious and carefully coached. "He knows how to make it grow big and strong so Tom and I can go to college and buy a house someday." The camera then showed Tom, barely 3 years old, waving a crayon drawing that showed 3 stick figures under a rainbow, Richard, Anna, and the children. Where my figure should have been, there was empty space, as if I'd been erased from their concept of family entirely. "My happy family," Tom chirped to the interviewer, his innocent voice unknowingly delivering the cruelest blow of all. I watched this footage on the shelter's single television, surrounded by other residents who didn't understand why I was crying over what looked like a heartwarming charity event. My grandchildren, whom I'd loved since the moment they were born, had been turned into weapons against me, their natural affection redirected toward the man who was stealing their inheritance. That night, lying on a narrow cot in a room I shared with 3 strangers, I seriously considered giving up entirely. What was the point of fighting when the very people I was trying to protect had been taught to see me as their enemy? I was contemplating the bottle of sleeping pills the shelter's nurse had given me for insomnia when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Morrison." The voice was elderly but warm, faintly familiar, though I couldn't place it. "This is Eleanor Chen. You probably don't remember me, but you helped save my family's financial future about 20 years ago when my husband was dying of cancer." The memory came flooding back, a terrified woman whose husband's medical bills had bankrupted them, who'd been targeted by unscrupulous financial advisors promising miraculous returns on her remaining savings. I'd spent months helping her navigate legitimate investment options and protecting her from predators. "Eleanor," I said softly, "of course I remember you. How are you?" "I'm doing well, thanks to everything you taught me. Mrs. Morrison, I've been following what's happening to you in the news, and I know exactly what you're facing. 20 years ago, someone tried to do to me what this Richard character is doing to you." Her words hit me like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. "Mrs. Morrison, I've been talking to some of the other people whose financial lives you saved over the years. We've put together a legal defense fund. We've also connected with a network of retired federal investigators who specialize in financial fraud and elder abuse cases. This isn't over. You taught us never to give up when facing predators, and we're not giving up on you." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: hope. Not the naive hope I'd clung to when I thought love and family loyalty could prevail, but something harder and more practical. The fierce determination that had driven me to protect clients from financial predators for 40 years was beginning to stir again. Richard thought he'd destroyed me, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd forgotten that I wasn't just a heartbroken grandmother. I was a professional who'd spent her career identifying and documenting patterns of financial fraud. And what he was doing to Michael's estate, what Mr. Davies was orchestrating, followed every textbook example of systematic theft I'd ever studied. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The invitation arrived in my email like a poisoned dagger forwarded by Eleanor Chen with a note that simply read, "Catherine, you need to see what they're doing in your name." The subject line made my blood boil. Financial Stewardship and Children's Future Gala. Keynote speaker Richard Coleman, CEO of Coleman Investment Strategies. I stared at that screen in the shelter's common room, my hands trembling as I read the promotional materials. Richard, the man who owed $700,000 in hidden debts, was being presented as a leading expert in responsible wealth management and protecting children's inheritances. The gala was being held at the city's most prestigious hotel, sponsored by financial institutions I'd worked with for decades. The description promised to address innovative approaches to estate management and recognizing when traditional investment strategies become obstacles to growth. Every word was a calculated attack on everything I'd built my career around. The conservative, methodical approach I'd used to build and protect wealth for hundreds of clients over 4 decades was being reframed as outdated thinking that stifled potential. I managed to scrape together enough money for a day pass to the public library where I could watch the live stream of the gala. What I saw there nearly destroyed what remained of my sanity. Richard took the stage in a perfectly tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, purchased with money stolen from my grandchildren's inheritance. He looked every inch the successful financial executive, his confidence radiating through the screen as he addressed a room full of wealthy investors and philanthropists. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, "I want to tell you about a transformation. A few months ago, I inherited the responsibility for managing my grandchildren's estate, a substantial inheritance left by their late father." Inherited the responsibility, as if guardianship of someone else's money was a birthright rather than a court-ordered theft. The previous management strategy, Richard continued, never mentioning my name, but making it clear who he meant, was based on outdated principles of extreme conservation. Every dollar was locked away in low-yield bonds and conservative funds, earning barely enough to keep pace with inflation. I watched in horror as my years of careful planning were recontextualized as financial incompetence. Every choice Michael and I had made to ensure long-term security for the children was being portrayed as timid, short-sighted thinking that would have condemned them to mediocrity. "But wealth isn't built through fear," Richard declared to enthusiastic applause. "Wealth is built through vision, through the courage to recognize opportunities that others are too frightened to pursue." He then presented a detailed analysis of what he called his transformation strategy for the children's inheritance. The numbers were impressive, showing projected returns that would have made any investor's mouth water. What he didn't mention was that these projections were based on high-risk investments that could just as easily result in total loss. Mr. Davies took the stage next, presenting himself as the legal expert who'd navigated the complex guardianship process to protect the children from well-meaning but misguided oversight. "Sometimes," Mr. Davies said, looking directly into the camera, "the people who love children most are the least equipped to make the difficult financial decisions their future requires. Emotional attachment can cloud judgment, leading to paralysis rather than progress." Emotional attachment, as if my love for my grandchildren was a character flaw that disqualified me from protecting their financial security. The cruelest part came when they screened a video segment featuring my grandchildren. Lily appeared on screen in a beautiful dress, standing in what looked like Richard's office, surrounded by charts and investment reports. At 5 years old, she recited words that were clearly scripted for her. Grandpa Richard taught me that money needs to work hard, just like people do," she said, her innocent voice delivering financial jargon that no child her age could possibly understand. "He's making our money grow really big so Tommy and I can have everything we need when we're grown up." Then came Tom, barely 3 years old, holding up a crayon drawing of what he'd been told was their financial future. The picture showed a house, a car, and stick figures with dollar signs floating around them like confetti. "Grandpa Richard is magic with money," Tom announced to the camera, his toddler pronunciation making the coached words even more heartbreaking. As the audience applauded these innocent children being used as props in their grandfather's fraud, I felt something break inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. But the most devastating moment came when Anna appeared in the video. My daughter-in-law, the woman I'd supported through pregnancy complications and midnight feedings, looked directly into the camera with what appeared to be genuine gratitude. "I don't know anything about investments or financial planning," she said, her voice soft and vulnerable. "I'm just grateful that my father has the expertise to make sure my children's future is secure. I know Michael would want someone experienced handling this responsibility. Michael would want." She was using my dead son's imagined wishes to justify the theft of his children's inheritance by a man who'd been absent from her life for most of her childhood. The live stream showed the audience throughout the presentation, and I recognized faces from my own professional past, colleagues who'd worked with me, clients whose portfolios I'd managed, industry leaders who'd respected my judgment for decades. They were all applauding Richard's presentation, buying into his narrative that I was an incompetent old woman whose conservative approach had nearly sabotaged these children's financial future. As I sat in that library, watching my life's work being systematically destroyed by people who'd never spent a day working with families in crisis, I felt the familiar rage that had once driven me to expose corruption within my own firm. But then I noticed something in the comments section of the live stream. Professional voices were beginning to question Richard's projections. "These return estimates seem unrealistic for current market conditions," wrote one financial planner. "The risk tolerance for an orphan children's trust should be much more conservative," added another. "This presentation feels more like a sales pitch than a genuine estate management strategy," observed a third. A few brave professionals were recognizing that Richard's smooth presentation was too polished, too focused on impressive numbers, rather than genuine protection of vulnerable children's assets. The seed of doubt had been planted. Richard's performance was so focused on discrediting conservative investment strategies that it was beginning to sound like exactly what it was, a predator's justification for gambling with other people's money. As I walked back to the shelter that evening, I realized that Richard had made a crucial mistake. In his eagerness to destroy my reputation completely, he'd overplayed his hand. The gala had been too slick, too perfectly crafted to make him look like a financial genius while making me look like a fool. To professionals who understood estate management for orphan children, Richard's presentation would raise red flags. Not about me, but about him. The very perfection of his performance was going to become the foundation of his downfall. The final financial assault arrived like a coordinated military strike designed to obliterate every last vestige of security and dignity I had managed to cling to. The lawsuit papers were hand-delivered to the shelter by a process server who seemed to take sadistic pleasure in humiliating me in front of the other residents. $2 million. Richard was suing me for $2 million in damages for emotional distress, reputational harm, and interference with lawful guardianship duties. According to the filing, my harassment campaign and public accusations had damaged his standing in the financial community and caused him severe psychological trauma requiring extensive therapy. Each accusation was a masterpiece of projection. My desperate attempts to protect my grandchildren's inheritance became malicious interference. My efforts to expose his financial history became defamation. My grief over losing access to my grandchildren became stalking behavior that threatened family safety. But the lawsuit was just the opening salvo in what would become total financial annihilation. Within days, I received official notifications from my former investment banking firm's retirement administrators. Serious concerns had been raised about my mental competency and professional conduct during my tenure. An investigation was being launched into allegations of misconduct, financial impropriety, and unstable decision-making that called into question my fitness to receive retirement benefits. The accusations were devastating in their scope. Someone had suggested that I'd shown erratic judgment in client portfolio management, that I'd overstepped professional boundaries in my advisory relationships, that my recent public behavior raised questions about my mental state during my final working years. My pension payments stopped immediately. My retirement savings were frozen, pending the outcome of the investigation. The professional honors I'd received over the years were quietly rescinded, my name removed from award lists and industry publications, as if 4 decades of exemplary service had never happened. But Richard wasn't finished with his systematic destruction of my life. The loss of my pension and mounting legal fees made it impossible to afford even basic shelter accommodations. The transitional housing facility where I'd been staying required a minimal monthly contribution that I could no longer meet. I found myself on the street again this time, with nothing but a shopping cart containing the few possessions that hadn't been sold to pay Richard's legal fees. The local news covered my eviction with barely concealed satisfaction. The story ran with the headline, "Former investment banker evicted amid mental health claims." The accompanying photo showed me loading my belongings into the cart, looking every inch the broken homeless woman society had decided I deserved to become. But Anna's response to my homelessness was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. When asked by reporters about my situation, Anna gave a statement that felt like a knife through my heart. "I have no legal or moral obligation to support someone who has chosen to pursue destructive litigation instead of accepting help. My priority is my children's stability, not enabling someone else's refusal to face reality." She followed this with social media posts about her busy schedule, with Lily and Tom sharing photos of family outings and activities that conspicuously emphasized their happiness without me. The message was clear. They were thriving in my absence, proof that I'd been the source of dysfunction rather than love. But Richard's cruelest masterstroke was yet to come. 3 days after my eviction made the news, the financial press ran a feature story about a revolutionary new investment facility. Richard had used money from Michael's estate to construct what he called the Coleman Financial Innovation Center, a state-of-the-art trading floor that he claimed would be used to maximize returns on high-value family trusts. The dedication ceremony was elaborate, with financial industry leaders praising the Coleman family's commitment to next-generation wealth management. Richard stood at the podium in a custom suit with Lily and Tom beside him, in matching outfits, as he spoke about their family's dedication to transforming traditional estate management. This center represents our commitment to ensuring that children's inheritances aren't just preserved, but maximized through innovative strategies and bold decision-making, he announced to the gathered crowd. The facility had been funded entirely with my grandchildren's inheritance money, but Richard presented it as his own generous investment in their future. The brass plaque by the entrance read, "Dedicated to Lily and Tom Coleman and the promise of tomorrow, transforming Michael's stolen legacy into a monument to Richard's fabricated success." The physical toll of homelessness was devastating. Living on the streets in autumn weather, surviving on free meals from church kitchens, sleeping in doorways and under bridges, my body began to fail under the relentless stress and exposure. I was waiting outside the emergency room, hoping to use their restroom and maybe find a warm place to rest for a few hours, when the massive heart attack struck. The pain was immediate and crushing, radiating down both arms as the world spun around me. I collapsed on the concrete steps of the hospital, where I'd once been a respected member of the community, reduced to another homeless person, having a medical crisis. The paramedics found me unconscious, clutching a library card. That was my only remaining identification. In the emergency room, as the doctors worked to stabilize my condition, I drifted in and out of consciousness, my mind retreating into memories that felt safer than the reality I faced. But in those twilight moments between life and death, something remarkable happened. A suppressed memory surfaced from 30 years earlier, when I'd risked my entire career to expose systematic fraud within my own investment firm. I discovered that senior partners were siphoning money from client accounts using complex trading schemes to hide their theft while blaming losses on market volatility. I'd spent months gathering evidence, knowing that exposing the fraud would destroy relationships I'd spent years building and likely end my career at that firm. But I'd done it anyway, because protecting clients' money was more important than protecting my own comfort. As the memory became clearer, I realized with shocking clarity what I was seeing: Richard's systematic theft of Michael's estate, Anna's willful blindness to his crimes, Mr. Davies's manipulation of the legal system to enable fraud. All of it followed the exact same patterns I'd identified and fought against 3 decades earlier. The very expertise that had driven me to expose corruption within my own firm was what I needed now to destroy the predator who was stealing my grandchildren's future. As I lay in that hospital bed, machines monitoring my failing heart, I felt something shift inside me. The devastating realization gave me a framework for understanding what had happened to me, but more importantly, it gave me the tools to fight back. I wasn't just a victim of family betrayal. I was a case study in systematic financial fraud and elder abuse. And if there was one thing I knew how to do, it was build a case that would destroy predators who thought they were too clever to be caught. When Eleanor arrived at the hospital, summoned by the emergency contact information I'd given the shelter, she found me weak but determined. "Catherine, thank God you're alive. We were so worried when we heard you'd collapsed." I gripped her hand with what little strength I had. "Eleanor, I need you to contact those investigators you mentioned. Tell them I'm ready to fight, but this time we're not just defending against Richard's attacks. We're going on the offensive." "What do you mean?" "I mean, Richard made a mistake when he decided to use my professional reputation as his weapon of choice. What he's doing to Michael's estate, what Mr. Davies is orchestrating, it's textbook financial fraud and elder abuse. And unlike family disputes, those things leave evidence. Those things leave paper trails we can follow. Those things destroy people who think they're too smart to get caught." For the first time in months, I felt like I was thinking like an investment banker again, building a case, following the money, protecting vulnerable assets from predators who hid behind facades of concern and expertise. Richard had destroyed my life, but in doing so, he'd exposed himself as exactly the kind of financial criminal I'd spent my career hunting. And now I had both the motivation and the expertise to destroy him. Recovery from the heart attack was slow and painful, but it gave me something I hadn't had in months' time to think clearly without the constant pressure of survival. The hospital social worker had helped me secure temporary housing in a medical recovery facility, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I had access to the technology and resources I needed to build my case against Richard. With Eleanor's help and the growing network of former clients who'd rallied to my defense, I'd managed to piece together the scope of Richard's criminal enterprise. But I knew that proving his fraud would require more than just financial records and professional testimony. It would require exposing the human cost of his crimes in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. That's when I decided to make one final appeal to Anna's conscience. Using the facility's computer lab, I carefully crafted a video message that laid out everything I'd discovered about Richard's true nature and the danger he posed to her children. I documented his hidden debts, his pattern of targeting grieving families, his systematic theft of inheritance money that should have been protecting Lily and Tom's futures. But the most crucial part of my message was when I played the audio recordings I'd saved from Richard's initial court appearances, where his mask had slipped and revealed his true motivations. "Listen to his voice, Anna," I said, looking directly into the camera. "Listen to how he talks about getting the money and managing those brats. And this isn't about protecting the children. This is about a desperate man using his own grandchildren as cover for theft." Then I revealed the card I'd been holding back, the secret that had shaped 13 years of our family's life. "Anna, there's something about Michael. You never knew something I've carried alone since he was 22 years old." I said, my voice breaking with the weight of finally speaking the truth aloud. "Your husband was diagnosed with a genetic illness that would have shortened his life significantly. I spent over $500,000 on experimental treatments to give him the time he had with you and the children. I watched my own image on the screen, seeing the pain etched in my face as I revealed the sacrifice I'd made to protect Michael's happiness. I never told him he was dying because I wanted him to live without that shadow hanging over him. I wanted him to believe he had decades with his family to plan for the future without the burden of knowing how limited his time was. Every year you had together was bought with my retirement savings and my silence." I paused, letting the weight of that revelation sink in before continuing. "Now Richard is stealing the inheritance Michael left for children he never knew might grow up without their father. The money I helped preserve through 13 years of secret treatments is being gambled away by a man who sees dollar signs where Michael saw his children's security." I ended the video with a plea that came from the deepest part of my heart. "Anna, I'm not asking you to choose me over your father. I'm asking you to choose your children over a predator who's using your grief to rob them of their birthright. Don't let Michael's sacrifice be for nothing." I sent the video through an encrypted email service, hoping it would reach Anna when she was alone, when she might be able to see past the poison Richard had been feeding her for months. I should have known that Richard would intercept it. 2 days later, Eleanor called me in a panic. "Catherine, turn on Channel 7. They're showing your video, but something's terribly wrong." What I saw on the news made my blood turn to ice. There was my video, but it had been systematically destroyed, edited, and manipulated to create something monstrous. My careful explanation of Richard's fraud had been cut and spliced to sound like paranoid rambling. Background noise had been added to make my voice sound shaky and unstable. My revelation about Michael's illness had been edited to make it sound like I was threatening to expose embarrassing family secrets unless Anna gave me access to the inheritance. The news anchor introduced the segment with barely concealed excitement. Tonight we have exclusive footage of disturbing video messages sent by a former investment banker to her daughter-in-law. We want to warn our viewers that this content may be difficult to watch. Richard had sold my private message to a tabloid news program, but not before having it professionally altered to support his narrative of my mental breakdown. The legitimate concerns I'd raised were dismissed as elaborate conspiracy theories, while the manipulated portions were highlighted as proof of my deteriorating grip on reality. But the cruelest betrayal came next. Anna appeared on camera in what looked like a family therapist's office, with Lily and Tom beside her. My daughter-in-law, who'd once looked to me for guidance and support, now spoke about me as if I were a dangerous stranger. "This is incredibly painful for our family," Anna said, her voice breaking in all the right places. Catherine was once someone we loved and trusted, but over the past year, her behavior has become increasingly erratic and threatening. The interviewer leaned forward with practiced sympathy. "This must be especially difficult, given her claims about your late husband's health." Anna nodded, wiping away what appeared to be genuine tears. Michael was a healthy man who died in a tragic accident. For Catherine to claim he was secretly ill, to suggest that she somehow extended his life through medical interventions. It's just heartbreaking delusion. She's rewriting our family history to make herself seem like a hero, instead of accepting that we've moved on without her. Then they turned to my grandchildren, those precious children I'd sung to sleep and comforted through nightmares. "Lily, Tom," the interviewer said gently, "I know this is hard to understand, but can you tell us how you feel about your grandmother, Catherine?" Lily looked directly into the camera, and I could see the coaching in her careful words. "We wish Grandma Catherine would stop being angry and scary," she said, her voice small but clear. "Grandpa Richard says she's sick in her mind, and that's why she says mean things about our family." Tom, barely 3 years old, nodded solemnly and held up a drawing he'd clearly been prompted to create. It showed their house with a big X marked over a figure that was supposed to represent me. "No more scary, Grandma," he said simply. The program concluded with Mr. Davies making a brief appearance, standing beside Richard in what looked like a legal office. He spoke about the importance of protecting children from unstable adults and the family's commitment to healing and moving forward from this difficult situation. "Our client family simply wants Mrs. Morrison to receive the mental health treatment she desperately needs," Mr. Davies said, managing to look both compassionate and concerned. "But their first priority must be protecting the children from further emotional trauma caused by these disturbing outreach attempts." The news segment went viral within hours. Social media exploded with commentary about the deranged grandmother and praise for Anna's courage in speaking out against family manipulation. Mental health advocates used my story as an example of how untreated grief and aging could turn elderly people into threats to their own families. But in the midst of this nightmare, something unexpected happened. Dr. James Martinez, a forensic accountant who'd worked with Eleanor's legal team, appeared on a competing news program the next night. He'd conducted his own analysis of the viral video and uncovered clear evidence of digital manipulation. "What we're seeing here is a sophisticated campaign of misinformation," he told the anchor. "This video has been heavily edited with audio tracks, altered sentences spliced together, and background elements added to create an impression of mental instability that simply doesn't exist in the original footage." He displayed technical analyses showing the digital alterations expert testimony about the telltale signs of edited media, and most importantly, financial records that revealed Richard's true debt situation and pattern of targeting vulnerable families. Moreover, Dr. Martinez continued, my investigation into Mr. Richard Coleman's business practices has uncovered a pattern of behavior that matches known cases of inheritance fraud. This isn't a family dispute about an elderly woman's mental health. This is a criminal enterprise targeting orphaned children's assets. Other experts began coming forward. Forensic video analysts confirmed the manipulation. Financial investigators who'd been tracking Richard's activities for months provided evidence of his fraudulent schemes. Former clients of mine testified about my professional competence and ethical standards. The competing narrative began to gain traction, but the damage had been done. In the court of public opinion, I'd been tried and convicted as a mentally unstable woman whose own family had courageously protected their children from my delusions. As I watched the media circus unfold from my small room in the recovery facility, I realized that Richard and Mr. Davies had made their most serious mistake yet. By manipulating and selling my private communication, by using my grandchildren as props in their public relations campaign, they'd created evidence of crimes that went far beyond family disputes. They'd documented their own conspiracy to commit fraud, defamation, and elder abuse. And they'd done it all on national television, with forensic experts already exposing their deception. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was looking at the beginning of the end. Not my end, but theirs. The federal courthouse was packed beyond capacity on the morning that would change everything. News crews from across the country had gathered to cover what had become a landmark case in elder abuse and financial fraud law, with overflow crowds watching on screens erected outside the building. Eleanor and her network had done more than just provide moral support. They'd uncovered a forgotten trust fund I'd established decades earlier for families facing financial crisis money that had grown substantially over the years and now provided the resources for an unprecedented legal campaign. The irony wasn't lost on me that a fund I'd created to protect vulnerable families would now finance my own rescue. Judge Patricia Williams, my former colleague who'd assembled the legal team, had brought together the most formidable coalition of legal experts I'd ever seen. A former federal prosecutor specializing in elder abuse, Dr. James Martinez, the forensic accountant who'd exposed Richard's media manipulation, and Patricia herself, whose reputation commanded respect throughout the federal court system. The charges were comprehensive and devastating: criminal elder abuse, systematic financial fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, defamation, and most importantly, the exploitation of vulnerable children's inheritance. Richard and Mr. Davies were facing serious federal time, and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had elevated this from a family dispute to a major criminal conspiracy case. But none of that preparation mattered as much as what was about to be revealed in that courtroom. Your Honor, Patricia said, approaching the judge's bench with a tablet in her hands, the plaintiff would like to present Exhibit A unedited video surveillance from Mrs. Morrison's home security system recorded during the period when the defendants were orchestrating their fraud. I watched from the plaintiff's table as she explained how I'd installed hidden cameras throughout my house after a break-in several years earlier. Neither Richard nor Anna had known about the system, which had been silently recording their conversations during those crucial weeks when Richard was planning his assault on Michael's estate. The first video segment showed Richard alone in what had been my living room, just days after Michael's funeral. He was practicing his guardianship petition speech, refining the arguments he would use to paint Anna as incompetent and me as a threat. Anna is emotionally fragile, Richard said to his own reflection in my mirror, his voice cold and calculating. She can't possibly handle a $1.3 million inheritance. My business experience makes me the obvious choice for guardian. But then his mask slipped completely, and his true motivations became clear. Finally, I can get my hands on Mom's money, he said with chilling satisfaction. That old hag thinks she's so smart with her investment banking background, but she has no idea what real money management looks like. Once I control this inheritance, I can pay off my debts and still have plenty left over for some serious investments. The courtroom was silent as Richard's recorded voice filled the space, revealing the predatory calculation behind his supposed concern for the children. But the most damning footage was yet to come. The next segment showed Richard coaching Lily and Tom, teaching them the lines they would recite for his charity event and media appearances. Now, Lily, when the nice man asks you about Grandma Catherine, what do you say? Richard prompted my 5-year-old granddaughter. She's scary and says mean things, Lily repeated dutifully, though her confusion was obvious. That's right. And Tommy, show me your drawing again. 3-year-old Tom held up the picture that would later be used to show their happy family without me. But the video revealed Richard guiding his little hand, telling him which figures to include and which to leave out. Very good. Remember, we don't want scary people in our happy family, do we? Watching my grandchildren being manipulated into weapons against me was devastating, but it also revealed the systematic nature of Richard's psychological abuse. These weren't spontaneous expressions of the children's feelings. They were coached performances designed to support his theft. The final piece of video evidence was perhaps the most shocking. It showed Richard tampering with my phone during one of his visits, deliberately disabling the GPS tracking to create gaps in my location data that he would later claim as evidence of my wandering behavior and mental decline. When the videos ended, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. The jury sat stunned, and even the judge looked shaken by the raw calculation they'd witnessed. Mr. Davies was called to testify first. The confident lawyer who'd orchestrated my legal destruction looked pale and shaken as he approached the witness stand. Mr. Davies, the prosecutor began, you've just seen video evidence of your client coaching children to make false statements and fabricating evidence of mental incompetence. How do you explain your role in this conspiracy? That's when Mr. Davies's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. The legal professional who'd used his expertise to enable fraud broke down on the witness stand, overwhelmed by the undeniable evidence of his complicity. I knew what we were doing was wrong, he stammered through tears. Richard convinced me that Catherine was genuinely incompetent, that we were protecting the children from her interference. But when he started coaching the kids, when I saw how he was manipulating everyone, his confession continued for nearly an hour, detailing how Richard had bribed courthouse staff to delay my legal filings, how they'd fabricated psychiatric evaluations, how they'd systematically destroyed my reputation through coordinated character assassination. When Richard took the stand, the transformation was even more dramatic. The confident manipulator who'd built his scheme on charm and false expertise was gone, replaced by someone who looked physically diminished by the weight of his exposed crimes. Mr. Richard Coleman, the prosecutor said, do you recognize your voice on those recordings? Richard's response was barely audible. Yes. And do you stand by your statements about getting Mom's money and your dismissal of Mrs. Morrison as that old hag? That's when Richard shattered completely. His face crumpled, and he began sobbing with the raw intensity of someone whose entire self-image had just collapsed. I was desperate, he cried. I owed so much money, and when Michael died, I saw an opportunity. I convinced myself that I could manage the inheritance better than Catherine, that the children would benefit from more aggressive investment strategies. The prosecutor pressed him further. And the coaching of the children, the manipulation of evidence. I know it was wrong, Richard wailed, but I was in too deep. Once I started lying, I had to keep lying to cover up the first lies. I destroyed everything, didn't I? I destroyed my own family for money I was going to lose anyway. As I watched this man who'd terrorized my family reduced to a broken shell by the truth of his own actions, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. This was Anna's father, my grandchildren's grandfather, and his destruction would traumatize the very children I was trying to protect. But the most powerful moment came when Anna, who'd been sitting in the gallery watching the evidence unfold, suddenly stood up and walked toward me. She'd been silent throughout the trial, her face a mask of shock and growing horror as she processed the reality of what her father had done. But when Richard broke down on the stand, confessing to using her grief and confusion to enable his theft, something inside her snapped. Catherine, she said, her voice breaking as she reached my seat. Oh God, Catherine, what have I done? Anna collapsed into my arms, right there in the courtroom, sobbing with the desperate grief of someone who'd finally seen the truth about the person she'd trusted most. I'm so sorry, she whispered over and over. I was so lost after Michael died, and Dad convinced me you were the problem. I should have known better. I should have protected you instead of helping him destroy you. Holding my daughter-in-law as she broke down with remorse, feeling her genuine anguish over her role in my destruction, I realized that this moment was more important than any legal victory. Anna hadn't been evil, just vulnerable and manipulated by someone who'd exploited her grief for his own gain. It's okay, I whispered back, meaning it completely. You're not responsible for his choices. We're going to rebuild our family on truth this time, and we're going to protect Lily and Tom together. As the court recessed and the media erupted into coverage of Richard's dramatic confession, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Michael's death, hope for our family's future. The truth had finally been revealed, but more importantly, the people I loved most were finally ready to hear it. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned to the packed courtroom, their faces told the story before the foreman even spoke. On the charge of criminal elder abuse, we find the defendant, Richard Coleman, guilty. On the charge of systematic financial fraud, we find the defendant, Richard Coleman, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to exploit minor children's inheritance, we find the defendant, Richard Coleman, guilty. The list of convictions went on for what felt like hours. Richard sat motionless as his fate was sealed, while Mr. Davies wept quietly at the defense table, his legal career ending in disgrace and criminal charges. Judge Patricia Williams, who'd presided over the case with the gravity it deserved, delivered the sentences with the authority that had made her one of the most respected jurists in the federal system. Mr. Richard Coleman, she said, your systematic campaign of financial fraud against vulnerable family members represents some of the most calculated cruelty this court has encountered. You exploited the grief of a widow, manipulated innocent children, and attempted to steal the financial security that a loving father had planned for his children's future. You are sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Mr. Davies received 5 years and permanent disbarment for his role in enabling the conspiracy. The financial restitution was comprehensive full return of Michael's inheritance to a trust I would manage payment of my legal fees, emotional damages, and restoration of my pension and professional standing. But more important than the criminal sentences was Judge Williams's formal statement clearing my name and vindicating my character. This court finds that Mrs. Catherine Morrison has been the victim of one of the most systematic campaigns of elder abuse and financial exploitation this jurisdiction has seen. Her character as a financial professional and grandmother is beyond reproach. Her actions throughout this ordeal demonstrate extraordinary courage and integrity in the face of unprecedented manipulation and cruelty. The vindication was complete and public broadcast live to millions of viewers who had followed the case. Editorial pages across the country condemned the abuse I'd suffered and praised my persistence in fighting back. Financial industry organizations that had once questioned my competence issued formal apologies and restored my professional honors. But for me, the most important victory was much quieter and more personal. Anna and I left the courthouse together, her hand in mine, both of us emotionally drained, but finally united in protecting what mattered most, Lily and Tom's future and our family's healing. "Catherine," Anna said as we walked to the car, "I don't know how to begin making up for what I allowed to happen to you. You begin by helping me be the grandmother those children deserve," I replied, "and by learning to trust yourself again. Richard manipulated your grief and confusion, but you're stronger than you know." The process of rebuilding our family was slow and often painful. Anna threw herself into therapy, working to understand how she'd been manipulated and developing the tools to protect herself and her children from future predators. I realize now that I stopped thinking for myself after Michael died, she told me during one of our weekly coffee conversations. It was easier to let Dad make all the decisions than to face how lost and scared I felt. But that laziness almost cost our children their security and cost you everything you'd worked for. Lily and Tom's healing was even more complex. They'd been profoundly confused by their grandfather's arrest and the revelation that much of what they'd been taught about me was fabricated. We started family therapy, all of us together, learning to communicate honestly and rebuild trust. Grandma Catherine, 5-year-old Lily, asked during one session, "Why did Grandpa Richard tell us you were scary? You make the best cookies, and you always hug us when we're sad." Explaining manipulation and deception to young children required careful balance, helping them understand that they'd been used without making them feel responsible for adult crimes. "Sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices," I told her. Grandpa Richard was worried about money, and instead of asking for help the right way, he decided to take money that belonged to you and Tom. He told you those things about me because he wanted to keep you away from someone who might protect your money. Tom, at 3, couldn't fully grasp the complexity of what had happened, but he responded to the stability and honesty that Anna and I worked to provide. Slowly, both children began to relax, to trust that the adults in their lives were finally telling them the truth. I also began the delicate process of explaining Michael's illness in age-appropriate ways. The children deserved to understand why their father had died so young and why I'd spent so much money on treatments they'd never known about. "Your daddy was sick in a way that made his muscles weak," I explained during one of our bedtime story sessions. "The doctors and I worked very hard to help him feel better so he could spend more time with you. He never knew how sick he was because we wanted him to be happy, not worried." 3 weeks after the sentencing, I received a letter from Richard in prison. His handwriting was shaky, nothing like the confident script I remembered from legal documents. "Catherine," it began, "I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, and I'm not writing to request forgiveness. I'm writing because I need you to know that I understand now what I did to you and Anna and the children and I am destroyed by the reality of who I became. The letter went on for pages, detailing his gambling debts, his desperation, his rationalization of increasingly terrible choices. But what struck me most was his genuine recognition of the harm he'd caused. "I stole more than money from those children," he wrote. "I stole their sense of security, their trust in family, and their relationship with the grandmother who'd always protected them. I turned their mother against the one person who could have guided them through their grief. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I see the truth now, and it will haunt me for whatever years I have left." Reading that letter in my kitchen, surrounded by photos of Michael and the grandchildren, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and closure. Richard's punishment was appropriate, but his genuine remorse suggested that somewhere beneath the desperation and greed, he'd retained some capacity for human decency. My other children, Mark and Lisa, had been conspicuously absent during the worst of my ordeal, uncertain how to navigate the family conflict and afraid of taking sides. But after the trial, they approached me with their own apologies and determination to rebuild our relationships. "Mom," Mark said during an emotional conversation, "we should have stood up for you from the beginning. We were cowards who let you face this alone because it was easier than confronting an uncomfortable truth." Their remorse was genuine, and while our relationships would take time to fully heal, I was grateful that the truth had finally freed us all to be honest about our failures and fears. But perhaps the most rewarding part of our family's healing was watching Anna grow into the strong, independent woman Michael had always seen in her. "I'm never going to let anyone make decisions for me again," she declared during one of our planning sessions for the Children's Trust Fund. "I want to learn everything you can teach me about protecting their inheritance. I want to be the kind of mother who could have seen through Richard's manipulation from the beginning." The legal victory was complete, but the real victory was quieter and more lasting. It was Lily asking me to help her plant a garden in memory of her daddy. It was Tom climbing into my lap for bedtime stories without fear or confusion. It was Anna becoming not just a daughter-in-law again, but a true partner in protecting and nurturing the children we both loved. Most importantly, it was the gradual return of something I'd thought was lost forever, a family built on truth, trust, and authentic love, rather than manipulation and hidden agendas. 2 years after the trial ended, I stood in my garden on a perfect spring morning, watching Lily and Tom help Anna plant tomatoes for the season. The house that had once felt like a monument to loss and betrayal was now filled with the sounds of genuine laughter and authentic family life. My home had been fully restored, but more than that, it had become what I'd always intended it to be, a sanctuary where family meant protection and support rather than manipulation and exploitation. The rooms where I'd been humiliated and threatened now hosted birthday parties and homework sessions, family dinners, and quiet conversations about hopes and dreams. Anna had moved back into Michael's house next door, but she visited daily, bringing the children for breakfast before school and staying for dinner most evenings. Our relationship had evolved into something deeper and more genuine than it had ever been when Michael was alive. "You know," Anna said one evening as we cleaned up from another family dinner, "I think Michael would be amazed by how strong we've become. He always worried about leaving us alone, but he never imagined we'd face something like Richard's betrayal and come out stronger." She was right. Our family had been tested by the worst kind of betrayal and emerged with bonds that were forged in truth rather than convenience. Anna had become not just a devoted mother, but a fierce protector of her children's future and a true partner in managing their inheritance. We'd restructured Michael's estate planning together, creating transparent trust funds that would support Lily and Tom's education and future while teaching them the value of financial responsibility. Anna insisted on learning every detail of the investment strategy, determined never again to be vulnerable to someone else's false expertise. I want to understand every dollar and every decision, she'd told me during our first joint meeting with the financial advisors. If something happens to you, Catherine, I need to be able to protect what you've helped build for them. Lily and Tom had flourished in the stability and honesty we'd worked to provide. They were thriving in school, surrounded by friends, and developing into confident, curious children who asked questions and expected truthful answers. Grandma Catherine, 8-year-old Lily, said to me recently while we worked on her science project, "I'm glad you fought for us even when we were too little to understand. Mommy told me that you gave up everything to keep our money safe." "I didn't give up everything, sweetheart," I replied. "I gave up things that didn't matter to get back the things that did. Money and houses and titles don't matter as much as family who love each other and tell each other the truth." My relationship with Mark and Lisa had also rebuilt itself on a stronger foundation. They visited regularly, now bringing their own children to play with Lily and Tom, and we'd all learned to navigate conflict through honest communication rather than avoidance. "You taught us something important," Mom, Lisa had said during a recent visit. "You showed us that sometimes fighting for what's right is more important than keeping the peace. We'll never let anyone hurt our family the way Richard hurt you." My professional life had taken on new meaning as well. The memoir I'd written about my experience, When Family Becomes the Predator, a financial professional's fight for justice, had become a bestseller and was being used in law schools and social work programs as a case study in elder abuse and financial exploitation. But more rewarding than book sales was the direct impact I was having on other families facing similar crises. My weekly support group for elder abuse survivors had grown to include over 70 members, and I'd helped dozens of families recognize and escape from financial predators targeting their inheritances. "You saved my grandchildren's future," an elderly man told me just last week. "My son-in-law was doing exactly what Richard did to you, and if I hadn't read your book, I would have signed over everything just to avoid the conflict." Every Tuesday and Thursday, I offered free financial counseling sessions at the community center, helping families navigate the complex world of estate planning and inheritance protection. The work was challenging, but deeply fulfilling, turning my painful experience into a tool for helping others avoid similar devastation. The financial ethics group I'd established had become like a chosen family, providing support and camaraderie for professionals who'd witnessed or survived various forms of financial abuse. We met monthly, sharing resources and strategies, ensuring that predators like Richard would find it increasingly difficult to exploit vulnerable families. Richard remained in federal prison serving his sentence and reportedly participating in therapy programs designed to help him understand the psychological patterns that had led to his crimes. I received occasional updates through the victim notification system, but I'd chosen not to maintain any contact with him. Mr. Davies had been permanently disbarred and was working as a paralegal in a small firm, his reputation and career destroyed by his role in the conspiracy. The legal community had used our case as an example of how attorneys could be held accountable for enabling abuse, leading to stronger professional standards and oversight. But perhaps the most satisfying transformation was in my daily life. The woman who'd once lived in fear of losing everything had become someone who understood that true security came not from avoiding conflict, but from having the courage to face it with integrity and determination. That evening, as Anna and the children prepared to head home after another family dinner, Tom approached me with a serious expression. "Grandma Catherine," he said, "when I grow up, I want to help protect people's money like you do. Can you teach me?" I looked at this little boy, who'd once been coached to call me scary, now asking to follow in my footsteps, and felt the deep satisfaction of a legacy built on love rather than fear. "Of course, Tommy," I said, hugging him tight. "The most important lesson is that money is just a tool. What matters is how we use it to take care of the people we love and help those who need protection." As I watched my family head home, their voices calling out, "Good night, Grandma, and see you tomorrow," I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment of peace. I'd lost years of my life to someone else's greed, suffered humiliation and homelessness, nearly died from the stress of systematic abuse. But I'd also discovered reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed, learned the difference between peace and justice, and found the courage to demand the truth even when lies were more comfortable. Most importantly, I'd learned that authentic love was worth fighting for, that family bonds built on honesty were stronger than those built on convenience, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's destructive choices. As I settled into bed that night, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a home filled with genuine love and trust, I felt the deep satisfaction of a life reclaimed, a legacy secured, and a future built on the unshakable foundation of truth. Years have passed since that terrible day when Richard first appeared in my life with his predatory schemes and false concern for my grandchildren's welfare. As I sit in my garden this morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope, I can barely recognize the broken woman I once was. My home is filled with authentic love again. Anna has become the daughter I never had her strength and wisdom earned through trials that tested us both. Lily and Tom visit daily, bringing homework questions and stories from school, their trust in me rebuilt on a foundation of truth rather than manipulation. Mark and Lisa call regularly, their relationships with me now honest and supportive in ways they never were before the crisis that revealed our family's true character. The woman who once cowered before a financial predator's threats, who accepted blame for protecting her family's assets, who nearly died from the weight of others' betrayal, has been transformed into someone I'm proud to be. Not because I sought revenge, but because I chose courage over comfort, truth over peace, and authentic love over the illusion of harmony. My work continues. Every week I counsel families torn apart by financial exploitation and elder abuse. I see my own story reflected in their pain, and I'm able to offer them something precious proof that justice is possible, that truth does prevail, and that love, when it's genuine and honest, always finds a way to survive even the cruelest betrayal. The deepest lesson I've learned is this: our greatest strength isn't in avoiding conflict, but in having the courage to confront deception when we see it, especially when it comes from people we're supposed to trust. True family loyalty means protecting each other from harm, not enabling each other's worst impulses. And sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to accept unacceptable behavior, even when that refusal costs us everything we thought we wanted. To anyone who finds themselves where I once was, facing the devastating betrayal of those who should protect them, I want you to know that your story doesn't have to end in defeat. Truth may be buried for a time, but it cannot be destroyed. Love may be wounded, but when it's genuine, it has the power to heal and renew. And courage, once found, becomes a flame that no amount of greed or manipulation can extinguish. I am Catherine Morrison, and I am free.